Hi everyone, welcome back to It's a Lot, Let's Talk. I'm Kylie.
And I'm JP.
So last episode we talked about what caregiving looks like inside of the workforce, and today we wanted to talk about what happens when families are waiting. So maybe they're waiting for a long-term care placement for their family member, or they're waiting for consistent home care. Essentially, while they're waiting for stabilization, what's happening? What are we seeing going on?
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I think in my own personal experience dealing with my mother, making that transition from independent living, living on her own to getting around the clock care, I refer to it as hallway caregiving, which parallels hallway medicine in the fact that,
Hmm.
people are getting treated actually while they're waiting in the halls to either see a doctor or doctors coming to see them, etc. I see that same thing happening in our homes. The hallway is not the hallway is the home as they wait for care, whether it be through, public pay kind of supports with regards to home care or waiting to get in a long-term care home, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I'm talking about those folks that are, assisted living. And so we have this challenge with families, with caregivers that after once I'm stabilized, what's the next step? Obviously becoming
Right.
stabilized is really key and important. And in my own experience, going through that stabilization period before I actually was stable, you know, had a big toll on myself and my sisters who were taking care of my mom, looking after my mom. But getting to that point where we're finally stable looks different for everybody, but which is critical before you can kind of stop, pause, and think about what's the next step to continuity care. So this notion of hallway caregiving is the same notion as hallway medicine, except that the hallway is your home and you're waiting for some sort of support mechanism to come in place so you can figure out, what the next steps are with regards to caring for the one that you're looking after.
Yeah, absolutely. It's essentially that the middle point between crisis and stabilization. It's what's going on, and families really absorb that. It's not visible to the everyday eye. It's hidden in the homes of everybody caring for someone, and it really impacts not only the person, but it impacts everything around them as well. And tying into what we were speaking about last week is workplaces, employers will really start to feel that impact. So, I mean, what does that look like when the senior is discharged but not stable? What
Mhm.
what does that time period look like? The months long, up to a year, like you said previously, those wait lists can be insufferably long. And when you're told it's a short-term solution, well, if you're on a list for over a year, up to a year, months at a time, that's not short term. That's a
Mhm.
long-term transition that families have to make, and they need to find something that fits their lifestyle for a period of time.
hmm Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's where that whole notion of hallway caregiving comes into play, right? Like
Yeah.
and I think you said it perfectly. What happens from the time that a crisis happens and until you're stabilized?
Hmm.
What does that look like? In my case, prior to my mother becoming stabilized and us figuring out what the next steps were, was, my sisters and I, basically setting up shifts. We're going to cover mom, you're going to cover mom on this kind of time frame, I'm going to cover on this, and so forth. And so, just by the very nature of having to put structure to it, disrupts, your whole life. And I don't want to
Yeah.
take it from a selfish perspective, but I have a family to raise, I have a full-time job and those types of responsibilities. And to add on to that, I was just fortunate I had two sisters that were, keen on contributing as well, which worked out really well. But I can't imagine somebody who's on their own taking care of a parent who is kind of going through this and what they have to deal with and those types of things that have to happen. You know, if you're working and something happens with mom, an emergency happens, what do you do at work? Do you take a sick day? Do you take a holiday day? Whatever it may be. You're just figuring it out all the time. And I think this patchwork of activities or things that we have to do, it really equates to hallway caregiving. That
Mhm.
whole notion.
Yeah, absolutely. And caregiver burnout is real, like you said, not to put it on yourself, but caregiver burnout is real and it's part of the issue because if you're burnt out, how can anybody expect you to properly show up for your mom, let alone your kids, your job, everything else you have going on in your life? So,
Mhm. Absolutely.
and I want to sort of tie in allotted home care hours too, because during that time period, uh, people will be allotted private home care hours that from the obviously from the government, from Lynn or CCAC. Um, but if you really think about that, and I was thinking about this morning actually, there's 168 hours in a week. And generally, someone will be given, let's think, 15 minutes for a shower 3 times a week. Let's round 4 to 8 hours a week. That's still 160 plus hours for an unpaid caregiver to step in and have to manage their parent. That's when you step back and you think about it that way, that's it reframes everything. It's
Right.
it's wild to think about, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's a good way of framing it, especially for those folks that haven't gone through this yet.
Hmm.
Think you before it happens, you think, oh yeah, we can figure it out. I had two siblings with me, so there's three of us, so we can take care of it. But in reality, there's a lot of open spaces that need to be taken care of. And in my mother's case, we knew a long-term care facility was the best option because she needed around-the-clock care.
Yeah.
But waiting for that, and filling those gaps along the way was very challenging, very
Hmm.
stressful. And tapping into and don't get me wrong, like the public pay kind of home care options are a great benefit.
Absolutely.
They may take a little longer because there's many that are demanding these services to set up. You're figuring out what's needed, what you're eligible for, and so forth. But until you get to the point where they say, okay, you're going to get X number of hours a week, what do? You're kind of scrambling. You're either, doing it yourselves, which is taking a time away from work, or you're paying out of pocket. But figuring out these types of things and that kind of state that you're in when you're waiting for a sort of a longer term solution and you're dealing within the moment, I think is what we're referring to as that hallway caregiving, right?
Yeah.
That I'm in kind of limbo. We're figuring out, we're getting it by, but as time goes on, stress increases, anxiety increases, your own health is impacted, negatively because you're worrying about these things, the
Hmm.
coordination efforts and so forth is really challenging. So, looking at those elements or dealing with those elements can be a very challenging time.
Oh, absolutely. And you know what they say, stress is the silent killer. And
Mhm.
living in these temporary moments or modes for 6 to 8 months or however long it's taking for um, your parent to get off the long-term care list or to receive stable home care in their home, whatever it is, these temporary modes for 6 to however long months it is, 6 to 18 months, whatever it is, it becomes chronic stress. That's not a short-term
Mm,
solution. It's a long-term hold of whatever's going on, like we said previously, but yeah, stress is definitely the silent killer, and caregiver burnout is huge. So,
absolutely. And we're preaching to the choir. Anybody that's experiencing this now knows exactly what they're going through. Like this, we're
exactly.
not saying anything that no one knows. But I think until you're actually doing it, and that's what we meant about a crisis happens and that's where you kind of activate. And I think that
Hmm.
again, that's human nature. But finding ways to prepare for that or deal with that is really key. In a perfect world, we'd have a plan, right?
Well,
In
even then, you
reality,
don't
that
know
doesn't
what you,
always happen.
yeah, sorry. But even then, you don't know what you don't know, right? You can
Mm,
plan up to this point, up to point of crisis all you want, but you have
right.
no idea what that's actually going to look like when it happens.
No.
You
No.
also can't predict. health outcomes. Anything can happen.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's inevitable. It's the world we live in.
Right. And you know that saying like hindsight's 2020. If as I look back
Exactly.
on my experience with my mother, there's things that I probably would have done differently or would have resources I would have tapped into and so forth. But that's hindsight.
Yeah.
Preparing for that is what's absolutely critical. So when you're caught in this kind of hallway caregiving state, um, you're essentially scrambling to figure out how to move to the next state, which is stabilization, and then the next state, which is continuity. But while you're in that state of crises, it becomes a very, very challenging. And I think that's more and more prevalent. You know, homes weren't built to manage crises. Homes were built to live in and to provide shelter and to provide, substance and all those types of things.
Yeah.
And when it transitions into, oh, I've got to figure out how to, or for how somebody can stay independent, it becomes a whole new set of challenges.
hmm Absolutely. And even being in those moments leads to, I'm sure you felt decision fatigue.
Mhm.
You definitely probably felt the chronic stress and the cognitive overload of everything. So,
Right.
how did that affect other aspects of your life, if you don't mind me asking? Did you feel it in the moment, hindsight being 2020?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I was working full time. So I'll talk to you from I'll talk about it from an employee perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
And definitely during that time, absenteeism increased. So, my time at work, even if I was physically there, I wasn't there
Yeah.
because I was dealing with talking with my sisters about what was happening with my mother, talking to my mother, figuring out what's happening with her, looking at different appointments and so forth. So it really took away, from my ability to do my job as effectively as I could. And I think that's a common thing and something sometimes often we forget about, of what's happening for people's careers and so forth. Let's face it, women are typically the main caregivers. They just have an innate ability to be strong at that. Not to say that men aren't, but usually that's what it comes down to. So I can only imagine how it impacted my sister's careers. There was three of us, but I know they're definitely taking the lead in terms of that.
Yeah.
So how it impacted them, opportunity and so forth. But it definitely comes into that play. And then the employer is kind of going, and fortunately, I had a great employer who supported me throughout the whole process. In fact, said, "Hey, take whatever time you need
That's
to,
awesome.
if
That's
you
so
need any
nice.
support." But I know not all employers are like that.
Yeah.
But definitely, there's an impact on employees, which means, ultimately, at the end of the day, there's an impact on employers. But um, something that we just have to be aware of that we never think of when a caregiving crisis comes into play, it impacts work.
Yeah, absolutely. We touched on it last episode too. Employers will track sick days or um, not showing up to work, whatever it is, but they don't track what's actually going on. They're not tracking that caregiver density inside their workplace, which I think could give them a different perspective of what's actually going on inside. And obviously, or hopefully, increase productivity by implementing some sort of support or solution for these unpaid caregivers. Because the reality is the population is aging. So employers should be putting in some supports at this point before it starts to get even worse than it already is. Because, I mean, age, like life expectancy is increasing. Obviously, there was a hit after COVID, but life expectancy is increasing. So naturally, people are going to be caring for their parents into their 80s and their 90s, which is amazing, but it's
Mhm.
also a huge issue, and it's not niche. It's a lot of people can relate to this. It's a structural workforce risk for sure.
Right. Absolutely. And I can only imagine from an employer perspective what they're going through right now in light of
Yeah.
RTO, return to office, right? So you have this juxtaposition between, employer wanting to support caregivers, right? And at the same time wanting them to come back to the office, where they very well know the best kind of environment or system that could be in place is that the caregiver has some flexibility, and remote work gives that.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you go back to the office, you're now confined to those walls, to that time frame, and so forth. So you, on one hand, you have these RTOs happening, and you have caregivers kind of managing their life and living in a world where it was remote, and they don't have to work at 9 a.m. They could do the work at 5 p.m. instead, as long as they're getting the work done, and that's totally flipping.
Yeah.
So, you have this juxtaposition between these two. Now, I'll never say to an employer, why are you bringing somebody back to the office? They have their own reasons.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they have to be careful on how they're promoting the notion that we care about those folks that are caring for others. So how do they find a balance between getting people back to work in the office, in person, versus allowing them the freedom to, care for the people in their lives. That's a
Mm-hmm.
huge challenge that they're facing against. So I don't know what that means for the future moving forward for unpaid caregivers. Are organizations, companies going to dig in their heel and say, yeah, we want everybody back at work? Or are they going to find some other structure that could come into place where it balances between the two, giving flexibility to the caregiver, but yet still having them come back to the office. And I understand from a theoretical perspective, conceptual perspective, why employers want their employees back in the office,
Yeah.
or that face-to-face time, that strengthening of the culture, the interaction, and so forth. But at the same time, giving some flexibility so that caregivers can deal with what they need to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Change.
I'm not sure what that would look like either.
Hmm.
Um, I think that the world we lived in before, workforce wise, the structure was completely different than what it is now. Um, Remote jobs have been huge after COVID.
Right.
And so, like you said, those unpaid caregivers who are at home who can juggle sort of caring for their parent while also getting their work done, I can see how an employer wouldn't love that. They're not
Mhm.
fully focused during the day on what they're supposed to be doing. But is that a solution to caring for their parent and also getting their work done? Like should there be more of a flexible time frame of when they need to get their work done? I don't know. And it's very organization
Mhm.
centered. It looks different for everyone, but
Mhm. Yeah.
I think even just having these conversations and raising awareness is a start. It's a start. Sometimes you don't know what's right in front of you, so some of these organizations may not even know what's going on. So normalizing these conversations and normalizing,
Hmm.
like we spoke about last week, some of those manager check-ins or implementing better supports for the caregivers or tracking caregiver density inside of teams so you know how to approach each of your employees. But then also, I guess you could encourage early planning
Yeah.
too. But
Yeah.
again, like we just spoke about, you don't know until you know, and it's going to
Right.
look different for everyone.
Yeah, and I think, the million-dollar question is this temporary? And the reality is no. It's
No.
only going to get worse, right?
Yeah.
Demographics are aging, we know that, and so forth. So organizations, like you said, taking a proactive approach to this, normalizing the conversation is absolutely critical. And the
Hmm.
reality is that, this has always been an issue. Caregiving has always been an issue for employers, you know,
Yeah.
more so, when dealing with female employees because of the very nature of, who they are and what they do with regards to caregiving. And it's an unfortunate reality. I think we talked about last week how, in fact, this caregiving, or the sandwich generation, um, women are not going up for promotions as much as they used to because of their split time between work and their caregiving duties. Not even their it's part of their personal life, but caregiving is just a whole new element. So
Yeah.
I shouldn't say a whole new element, it's a whole element that has to be considered. So organizations today, I think need to realize and own up to the fact that this is going to be in for the long term. So putting mechanisms in place that support their employees who are caregivers is absolutely critical to their productivity as an organization, whatever they're producing. And if you have an individual whose attention is split between what's happening at home versus what's happening in the job, productivity is going to suffer.
Right.
And I think when one that is recognized, that's an important step towards figuring out what can be done. And two, getting creative in terms of what mechanisms, can be implemented to deal with this. And the reality is this, many organizations, mid to large organizations, not speaking for small organizations, have EAPs or employee assistance programs. And more within these EAPs are caregiving support mechanisms that
Mhm.
provide either navigation in terms of where individuals can go to seek out support for their situation, and that is becoming more and more popular within these EAPs. And I think that needs to kind of continue. That needs to be explored and so forth. In terms of the return to office protocols that are being implemented, you know, they're going to have to think long and hard. Why do they want employees at the office? What's the reason? Is it a cultural thing? Is it a face-to-face thing? Is it a necessity of the type of jobs that they're performing? And two, is there a way of kind of creating a hybrid version of that? Maybe not every day of the week, Monday to Friday that they're in, which we know that's already exists, um, and kind of breaking it up that way. And then three is looking at each individual's situation. My situation may have been different than somebody else's, where I wasn't the only caregiver. There was three of us, so we could spread that, those duties, those responsibilities across, versus somebody who's an individual and, is the only child or is not the only child, but the only one willing to take care of their parent, looking at that. So I think, it's probably uh, a necessity for organizations to kind of pause, step back, think about not only the internal factors that are impacting their employees' ability to be productive, but what are some of the external factors that are, prohibiting their employees from being productive, and kind of thinking about different options, not one size fits all approach, but how can we become as flexible as possible so that one, we meet our organizational objectives, but also the employees meet their objectives, whether it's, career or personal, and there's a balance between those two things. And I do think it's possible. It's just taking a strategic look at ways of kind of recognizing and incorporating mechanisms that support people in being able to balance both. So it's a convoluted, long, multivariate kind of solution, but one that can be done if thought through consciously.
Yeah, and it's very individualized to each organization.
Mhm.
Each person too, like you said, your story is different than the next and the next. So, I mean, I don't think the question is, or well, I guess the question isn't whether families are waiting and what's happening to each individual because they're obviously caring for a parent if they're a caregiver, or they're in the sandwich generation, they're also juggling their children and work, whatever. But the question then becomes, what are they doing while they're waiting? Is their organization helping them? Are they receiving care supports from their siblings or their spouses? Do they also have kids they're looking after? A social life? It's so individualized to each person that it becomes hard for these organizations. But again, it's just coming back to having these conversations and implementing a plan now so you can have stabilization when crisis hits.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And the thing with hallway caregiving versus hallway medicine. Hallway medicine is visible. You can walk down a hospital and you can see the
Exactly.
hallways lined with stretchers, beds, whatever you want to call them. And hallway caregiving isn't. It's
Yeah.
not visible, but it definitely exists. It's happening. It's happening in our communities. It's happening in our cities. It's happening people that are employed by organizations and so forth. And it will never go away. It perhaps over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years may increase, in fact. So,
Yeah.
recognizing that is pretty key. And some of the other facts too, in terms of long-term care homes in Ontario specifically, the wait lists are only going to get longer.
Yeah.
Right,
Unfortunately.
which breaks my heart because people are going through that crisis where they're in between a long-term care home and having to have their parent stay at home or somebody's home. And
Yeah.
what do they do in the meantime? So hallway caregiving, it is invisible, but it happens in homes throughout the community.
Yeah. It really does. It's unfortunate, but again, the question is, what are we doing about hallway caregiving and what can we do to sort of ease that a little bit? And we don't have the answer, but we're here to talk about it, so it does raise awareness and
True.
normalize these conversations. I think a lot of unpaid caregivers are not having these conversations. People will sort of internalize a lot of their thoughts and feelings about it because it's not from my at my age and coming from my perspective. I think we spoke about this on one of our first episodes, is I'm not thinking about caring for my parents at all at my age. And I bet you weren't thinking about caring for your parents until you got into the thick of it. So
Mhm.
I think normalizing these conversations now is important, very important for everyone.
Completely.
You know.
And I think, we've been talking a lot about obviously personal aspects of my journey, but also my career aspects, and that comes into play the employer. And employers, I think, need to realize there's a very thin line between, an employee's personal life and their work life.
Yeah.
Right. And they bleed into others. Like, we think about early days in our career, at least in my career, you know, career bleeded over into family life, into personal life, and so forth. As you get older, maybe it kind of balances more to the middle. But what's forcing it not to go to the middle now is having to care for somebody else.
Yeah.
Right. And it really, that line started to blur more and more. Um, and interesting enough, as even as I say that, when I was early start of the career, the line blurred into the personal life. Now the personal is bleeding into the work life.
Yeah.
And, so am I saying that my prime years were when I was younger? Maybe, perhaps, at least my attention and my focus was definitely more on the work side.
Right.
However, my competence increased as I got older through experience, through further education, through training, through interaction, and so forth. And now it's my personal is bleeding over into my work life, but the organization is kind of caught between a rock and a hard place where they know, hey, we got this competent dude. How do we keep them engaged when we know they've got some personal stuff? So how do we lessen the blur? And I think at the end of the day, that's what an organization needs to try to do. And
Yeah.
and we're seeing it. Like, we're saying employers, we're not saying anything, but employers are starting to recognize it. And that's a good thing. That's the first step towards finding a solution. And there'll never be a perfect solution, but definitely the right direction to finding a solution. And through these EAPs, through these support networks, through, the system as a whole getting stronger and better is really key. But
Absolutely.
just keeping it top of mind is absolutely critical. And hallway caregiving exists. You can't see it. You may not be able to touch it. It often happens in isolation, which is much more scarier than hallway medicine. Hallway medicine, you can label it, you can point to it, you can see when it's happened, you can see when it's not. Hallway caregiving is the total opposite. And that's what scares me. And I think organizations, society as a whole need to recognize that and address it accordingly, whether it's from a systemic perspective, or whether that's from individual support perspective, or whether that's from employers providing those resources and implementing those mechanisms. It's a number of different factors that we have to think about. But really challenging times for sure for everybody involved.
Absolutely. I think you summarized it perfectly. There's a lot to think about, a lot going on that we don't see every day. And so, again, I'll just say the question isn't whether families are waiting, it's what are we doing or what are they doing while they're waiting? And that's where organizations need to step in. That's where we need to find some type of solution. So, I think this is a good wrap up. Like I said, that was a great summary from you. So, Um, unless you have anything else to say,
Well,
any points to add?
it's a lot. Let's talk.
I love it. Thanks so much for tuning into It's a Lot, Let's Talk. If today's conversation resonated with you, we'd love for you to stay connected. You can find us on Facebook at Caredera, on Instagram at Caredera app, and on LinkedIn at Caredera to keep up with the new episodes and join the conversation. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or even just say hi. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to stay tuned for new episodes dropping soon. Thanks again for listening. Take care, and remember, you're not alone in this.